to turn to Genesis 45. We'll read the 15th verse. Moreover, he, Joseph, kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And after that, his brethren talked with him. The final 14 chapters of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50, record the story of Joseph, a remarkable story, a story filled with many wonderful and encouraging truths about God. We see in the record of Joseph that God is the one who makes the difference, that God is behind all the scenes, that God is in absolute control, working out His purposes, sovereignly managing the affairs of Joseph's life. And God is able to take tragedy and turn it into triumph. And God is able to use the negative experiences of life for our own good, for the good of others. The life of Joseph really is the Old Testament illustration of Romans 8:28. At almost every turn in Joseph's life, you could insert Romans 8:28. It's a vivid illustration of but God. But God. It's also filled with much instruction concerning living life. It's an illustration of the life that we can live. It's an illustration of the life we should live. Beginning in chapter 37, we see Joseph showing us that the child of God can thrive and do what's right in the midst of adverse circumstances. That Joseph, in spite of, the family of Joseph is very dysfunctional. But he served the Lord. Never used it as an excuse. It shows us that when terrible things happen to an individual, there is a proper way to respond. And we see that over and over in Joseph. It's a lesson that shows us that the child of God can rise above terrible situations. It's an illustration of what a truly committed person can do in the service of the Lord. In Joseph, we see one who did not quit. Didn't seem to ever lose his focus upon the Lord. And like our own lives, the life of Joseph is filled with many different scenes. But whether Joseph was in his father's house, or in a pit, or in the possession of slave traders, or in the house of Potiphar, or in prison, or exalted upon a throne, he did what was right. And we see that over and over in the life of Joseph. And that's why we say Joseph, more than any other Old Testament figure, is a portrait of Christ. And again, here in Genesis 45, we come to the climax of his life. He has the opportunity to get even with his brothers. He has the opportunity to ruin them. But instead, he blessed them. He provided protection for them. And he forgave them. There is the saying, of course, we've all heard it, to err is human, to forgive is divine. That's very true. And we have an illustration of forgiveness in Joseph. No greater, no clearer illustration of you and I forgiving others than what we have here. Joseph forgiving his brothers. So I want to speak on forgiveness illustrated in Joseph. First of all, we just want to think generally about the matter of forgiveness, of forgiving others. It, of course, involves two parties. There is the offended party, and there is the offender. And we can, all of us, identify from both sides. We have been the offending party, and we have been the offended party. So we ought to be able to understand the matter of forgiveness because we've experienced it from both sides. We have needed forgiveness, and we have needed to forgive. So again, we have experienced the matter from both sides. But in spite of that, when it comes to the subject of forgiving others, it's something that we tend to struggle with from time to time. Most expect others to forgive them. Most feel that they have a right to be forgiven. But they will hold on to their perceived right not to forgive others. They expect others to forgive them, but no, after what you've done, don't expect me to forgive you. And people struggle with this. You see, we have to be careful that we do not get caught in the trap of thinking that we have a right not to forgive. And people try to hang on to that supposed right. People will ask all the time, well, if someone doesn't ask for forgiveness, am I obligated to forgive them? Why do you even ask that question? Because you don't want to forgive them. Let's be honest. Or you wouldn't even ask the question. We struggle with that. We struggle with our perceived right not to forgive. So we must beware of objecting to forgiveness due to the wrongness of what has been done or what we perceive has been done. But here in Genesis 45, we have this picture of the forgiveness of others. So again, there's the offending party, there's the offended. Consider the offense against Joseph. Genesis 37:4, they hated him. That's an offense. They hated him. They felt an intense hostility toward their brother. They had an aversion to their brother. They possessed enmity toward their brother. They were filled with resentment. They were filled with bitterness and animosity. They had ill will toward Joseph. So much so that they could not speak peaceably unto him. It's not that they would not, that is true, but they couldn't. Because of this hatred, they could not speak peaceably unto him. So you imagine, this didn't just happen one time. There were many days, due to their hatred. It doesn't say they could not speak to him, but they could not speak peaceably to him. The implication is that they did speak to him, but not peaceably. So there were many days that they spoke to him in a tone of mockery. Many days that they spoke to him in a tone of slander. We read in verse 8 of Genesis 37, they hated him yet the more. So their feelings were intensified toward him, and therefore we can assume that their mockery and their slander of him also intensified. All the wounds of words. And you think of all the days that they said something to Joseph that wounded him. Again, somebody hates you. Best thing to do is stay away from them. But in this case, that wasn't a possibility. They were being raised in the same house. So it wasn't something he could get away from. Joseph was being wronged every day by his brothers. Every day they hated him, they were wronging him. Every day they spoke in mockery, they were doing him wrong. It was offense upon offense. And we read in verse 11 of Genesis 37, and his brethren envied him. Well, we're told in Proverbs 27:4 that wrath is cruel, and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? And every day they envied him. And Joseph dealt with this on a daily basis, every day. In verse 20, his brothers plotted against him. Their intention was to kill him. And again, they would have had not Reuben intervened there in verse 21. So instead of killing him, they plot and they cast him into this pit. And Joseph is a victim of their plotting. He is betrayed by them. He is rejected by them. He is conspired against by his own brothers. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. Notice in Genesis 37, verses 23 and 24. And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. So they stripped him of his coat, and they cast him in what I believe was an empty well. And with their brother in that empty well, they sit down and they eat. But we learn from later testimony. Notice Genesis 42:21. So there's Joseph. He's down in this pit, this empty well. And there's his brothers sitting nearby, eating, talking. But notice Genesis 42:21. And they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us. They saw the anguish of his soul as they cast him into that empty well. And they heard his pleas. Don't do this. Don't do this. And they ignored him. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. They ignored him after they cast him into this pit. In verses 25 through 27 of chapter 37, Joseph's brothers plot to profit off of Joseph. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. Verse 28, they sell him. They sold him. Again, all the wrong that was done to Joseph. From that wrong, he was brought down to Egypt and sold to a man named Potiphar. Also connected to the wrong that his brothers had done him, he is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. It would have never happened had not his brothers sold him into slavery. And he was imprisoned. Again, it would have never happened were it not for the wrong done to him by his brothers. And there he is, in a prison. Not because of any wrong that he had done, but it all goes back to the wrong that was done to him by his brothers. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. And going back to the wrong that was done to him by his brothers, there was a 22-year separation from his father. For 22 years, he did not see his father. He did not know the welfare of his father. All because of the wrong that was done to him. He's the offended party. But Joseph forgives his brothers. Genesis 45, he not only forgives his brothers, but he blesses them. He does them good. He forgives and does them good. That's something in addition to forgiveness. Verse 15, we see that he kisses all his brothers. And his brothers then converse with him. In verse 21 and 22, we see that He blessed his brothers with provision. Joseph, the one who has been grievously wronged, forgives. Forgives. Forgiveness is a choice. We choose to forgive. We also choose not to forgive. But forgiveness is a choice. The offended party, in order for forgiveness to take place, the offended party must be willing to forgive. The offended party must be ready to forgive. Well, I'm not ready yet. Well, that's a choice. That's a choice. May I ask when you will be ready? The offended must be desirous to forgive the wrong done. Well, I'll forgive them, but I don't want to. Well, you're not going to forgive them either. The offended party must want to forgive them. They desire to forgive them. Joseph, the wronged one, and oh, how he was wronged. You and I have never been wronged like Joseph was wronged. As far as I know, no one here has been sold by someone else. But Joseph was willing to forgive. Joseph was ready to forgive. Joseph was desirous to forgive. Someone might say, yeah, but it took him 22 years. I don't think so. I think Joseph was willing, ready, and desirous to forgive from the very beginning. Just so happened, it just worked out. 22 years later, he was able to do so. Forgiveness is a choice. It is a choice not to bring to remembrance the offense. We read concerning God's forgiveness in Jeremiah 31:34. I will forgive their iniquity. That's a choice. That is a choice by God. God chose to forgive you and I. That's amazing. But God chose to forgive us. I will. I am willing. I am ready. I am desirous to forgive their iniquity. But there's another part of it. And I will remember their sin no more. That also is a choice. I will not. I choose, God. This is God speaking. I choose not to remember their sin. I am willing not to remember their sin. Now, that's an amazing thing to me. That God forgets sin because God is omniscient. But yet He forgets sin. So it's an amazing thing. Now, we all know. Because people will say, I forgave them, but I can't forget. And that's true. There may be times when that is absolutely true. Only God can entirely forget. But in human forgiveness, the forgiver chooses not to bring attention to the sins of the forgiven. Oh, I forgive them, but I'm going to remind them of it every chance I get. That's not forgiveness. Oh, I forgive them, but I'm still going to spread around what they've done. And I'm still going to try to ruin them. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness chooses. Though you may not forget it up here, forgiveness chooses not to bring it up again. Not to bring it up again. You forgive somebody. 2 days later, they do the same thing. And you say, I knew it. I knew it was going to happen. You do the same thing over and over and over. You haven't forgotten. You brought it up. Had you forgotten, you wouldn't bring it up. You don't bring up the past. You don't bring it up. That's how we are to forgive. So Joseph, 17 years old, when his brothers sold him into slavery. That act resulted in him not seeing his father for 22 years. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. Now our text, Genesis 45, it's 22 years later. So Joseph is 39 years old here in Genesis 45. And Joseph and his father would be reunited. And as you read on, you see that Joseph and his father then had 17 years together before Jacob died. So that makes him 56 years old. And upon Jacob's burial, 39 years after the sin against Joseph, Joseph's brothers are afraid, now that Dad is gone, Joseph might change his mind. And Joseph might decide to punish us. But notice Genesis 50. This is 17 years after Genesis 45. Verse 13. For his sons carried him, Jacob, their father, into the land of Canaan and buried him. Verse 14, Joseph returned into Egypt, he and his brothers. So they've had a funeral. They return home. And all that went up with him to bury his father after he had buried his father. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite or require us all the evil which we did unto him. So they send a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command thee before he died, so shall you say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren, and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren, after they send this messenger, they came and they fell down before Joseph. Because again, they're fearful that Joseph is going to judge them. Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, 17 years later, Fear not, for I am in the place of God. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you. He's not bringing their sins to remembrance. 17 years later. And your little ones, and be comforted. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. So 17 years since Genesis 45, Joseph still is not bringing attention to their sins. Joseph is 56 years old. He would live another 54 years because he lived to the age of 110. And notice the words of his brothers as Joseph was dying. 54 years after Jacob. Genesis 50, verse 24. And Joseph, he's on his deathbed, said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you. Now, if there's a period there, that wouldn't be good. But there isn't. For God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which He sware unto Abram, Isaac, and to Jacob. He's forgotten. He isn't bringing it up, let me put it that way. He's saying, don't worry. God's going to bless you. God's going to take care of you. So there he is. 71 years after our text, still not bringing attention to their sins. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. But Joseph chose to forgive and not bring it up again. Forgiveness is a willful letting go. People say, I forgive, but I can't let it go. Well, that's not forgiveness. You better be glad that when God forgave your sin, He let it go. You better thank God for that. Well, I just can't let it go. That's choice. Forgiveness is a willful letting go. Now, in our text, when Joseph and his brothers are together there in Genesis 45, he forgives them. And I just imagine, in my mind, the voices that were in Joseph's head at that time. Joseph, didn't they hate you? Joseph, didn't they mock and slander you? And Joseph could say this, yes, they did. But I'm willing to let that go. I'm willing to let it go. Joseph, didn't they cast you into a pit? Because when you and I are about to forgive somebody, the devil begins to whisper. Didn't they do this? Joseph, didn't they cast you into a pit? And when you pleaded with them, did they not ignore you? Yes, they did. But I want to let that go. I want to let it go. Didn't they sell you into slavery? Yes, they did. But I'm letting that go. For 22 years, they never came looking for you, Joseph. Joseph, they didn't care about you. Yeah, you're right. 22 years, they never looked for me. They didn't care. But I'm going to let that go. That's forgiveness. Joseph, you've been mistreated. Oh, the devil's quick to let you know when you're mistreated. Joseph, you've been mistreated. You've been grievously wounded by your brothers. As a result, you were wrongly imprisoned. Yes, all that's true. But I choose to let it go. Due to your brother's act, you've not seen your father for 22 years. You've had miserable evenings thinking about your father. You've had miserable days missing your father. 22 years, Joseph. Yeah, you're right. But I let that go. That's forgiveness. That's forgiveness. Joseph chose to let it go. Joseph was willing to let it go. Forgiveness involves the denial of self and the preference of others above ourselves. And Joseph, the one who was so grievously sinned against by his brothers, denied himself and preferred the well-being of his brothers. So that leads to the question. That's forgiveness. How was Joseph able to do this? Because immediately we think, well, I can't do that. But you can. You can. And you'll do it the same way that Joseph did it. So we've got to know, Joseph, how did you forgive them? How were you able to forgive them? Because it would have been the natural thing for Joseph to be overcome with anger. 22 years, the natural thing is for the anger to just build. And the bitterness. All of that would have been normal. It would have been normal for Joseph to be given in to self-pity and to formulate revenge against his brothers. But instead, Joseph forgave his brothers of their hatred, of their envy toward him. He forgave his brothers of their mockery, of their slander. He forgave them of their coldness and hardness of heart toward him. He forgave them of their plotting against him. He forgave them for casting him into a pit and ignoring his pleas. He forgave them for selling him into slavery. Joseph was the object of his brother's resentment. Joseph forgave him. He was the object of their bitterness. He was an object of their animosity. He was an object of their ill will. Yet Joseph willingly forgave them. Joseph desired to forgive them. And Joseph chose to forgive them. That's contrary to human nature. Everything about it is contrary to human nature. We ought to know that. The question is, how was Joseph able to do this? How did he do this? We're instructed in Ephesians 4:32. Be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. That's our duty. That's our obligation. But how do we do that? Colossians 3:13. Forgiving one another, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. Now you take those two verses, Ephesians 4:32, Colossians 3:13. They declare a duty that we have toward others who do us wrong. And to do what is written there is a privilege. Well, how can you say it's a privilege? Because it's what God told us to do. So therefore, it is a privilege. But again, we still have to ask, how do we do this? How do we do this? We know, or we should know. I'm afraid there's some that don't know, but we ought to know. I'm sure everybody here knows that no matter what we forgive in others, it is less than we've been forgiven by God. Regardless of what they've done, it's less than what we've done to God. We need to know that. We know that no matter how many times we forgive the same trespass, it is less times than we've been forgiven the same trespass over and over and over. We lose sight of that. We struggle. Most do. Everyone does from time to time. We struggle with forgiveness. So how are we able to forgive the wrong done to us? How do you get to that point where you can do that? Where you want to do that? Oh, the wrong that was done to Joseph. Yet Joseph chose to forgive. How? Joseph chose to forget the wrong. How was he able to do so? Joseph was able to let go of the wrong. How was he able to do so? Joseph was able to deny himself and prefer the good of his brothers, the very ones who sinned against him. We say many times, well, I forgive them, but I sure hope God lets them have it. Well, I'm glad God doesn't forgive that way. Joseph was able to deny himself and prefer the good of his brothers. I forgive them and I hope God blesses them. That should be our attitude. I hope nothing but good comes upon them. You see, forgiveness and unforgiveness is a matter of perspective. It's a matter of what we focus upon. Imagine for 22 years had Joseph focused upon the wrong that was done to him. No way would what we read in Genesis 45 have taken place had he been focused upon that. So it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of focus. So if we say to ourselves, well, I just can't forgive them. Well, you know what that says? That says that you have a wrong perspective. That you're focusing on the wrong thing. And yes, you were right. You can't forgive them as long as you have the wrong perspective. And as long as you have the wrong focus, you can't forgive them. So it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of focus. What is the one thing that we see throughout the life of Joseph? He was focused upon God. Every circumstance in Joseph's life that is recorded, we see that there was a focus upon God. It's seen throughout his life. And by that I simply mean that Joseph was a man who was able to see God no matter what happened. He was able to see God's hand. Notice in Genesis 39. Genesis 39, verse 9. He's in Potiphar's house. There's Potiphar's wife. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee. Because thou art his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar? That's not what it says. And sin against God. What was his focus? His focus was God. What was his priority? His priority was God. In Genesis 40, verse 8, he's in prison. And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Where's his mind? God. Tell me them, I pray you. He saw God. In Potiphar's house, God was his priority. In prison, God was his priority. Later on, he would be called before Pharaoh to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Notice Genesis 41, verse 16. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer. Where's his focus? God. Verse 25. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh. God. That's his focus. Verse 28. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do. God is his focus. Pharaoh isn't the focus. God is the focus. Verse 32. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God. And God will shortly bring it to pass. He saw God. God was his priority. Regardless of what his circumstances were, he could see God. And God was his priority. When Joseph's wife bore him 2 sons. Notice Genesis 41, verse 51. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. Why? For God said, he hath made me forget all my toil in all my father's house. Why did he name him Manasseh? God. Verse 52, and the name of the second called he Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So when his wife bore him 2 sons, he gave them names that bore witness of God's faithfulness to him. Joseph was focused upon God has been faithful to me. My brothers did me wrong, but that's not the focus. The focus is God's been good to me. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of focus. If you want to think all night as you lie in bed of the wrong that's been done, you won't get to Genesis 45. If you want to think about how good God's been to you, and God become your priority, you'll be able to forgive. When his brothers came to buy grain, he could not hide his relationship with God the first time they came. And he said to his brothers in Genesis 42:18, "This do and live, for I fear God." Hadn't revealed himself to them, but he told them, "I fear God. I reverence God." When they returned with Benjamin this time, still disguising himself in Genesis 43:29, he said, "God be gracious unto thee." Where's his focus? Somebody does you wrong. Somebody does you wrong. They haven't done to you what Joseph's brothers did to him, and they haven't done to you what you've done to God. But someone has done you wrong. What is our thought? I hope God punishes them. Or, I hope God blesses them. Which is it? Which comes to our mind? Depends where our focus is. If our focus is upon God, if God is our priority, we should want God to bless them. Well, that's the attitude we need. But how do we get that attitude? Well, I can't have that. I can't think that way. Well, you could if your focus was on God. You could if your priority was God. So you see, when we say, "I can't forgive them," what you need to confess to God is, "Lord, you're not my focus. You're not my priority. I need you to be." And once that becomes true, guess what? You'll be able to forgive. But as long as your focus is upon the wrong, you know what happens to that? We magnify it. We magnify it. It becomes bigger and bigger, and pretty soon it's bigger than the offense that was really done. He saw God in it all. From the day they threw him in the pit, Joseph was able to see God. That tells me this: he maintained a relationship with God. How do you forgive others? You got to see God. See God. Yes, they did me wrong, but God's blessed. Yes, they did me wrong, but not even close to what I've done to God. They did me wrong, but I'm not going to focus upon the wrong. I'm going to focus upon God. And then you're able to forgive. Joseph had a profound sense of God's presence. That's why you read over and over throughout the circumstances of Joseph's life, and God was with him. And God was with him. He had a profound sense of God's presence. So much so that he understood. We say we do, but we don't. He understood that every evil in life somehow comes back to God. God was the center of his life. And you see that in Genesis 45, verse 5, verse 7, and verse 8. Joseph expresses that. He is saying, God's been in control of the whole process. Do we believe that? He was saying to his brothers, everything that happened, the good and the bad, was all part of God's plan for his life. If we view that life that way, so-and-so has done me wrong, but if I believe God's in sovereign control, then it must have been part of God's plan. Must have been part of God's plan for that person to do me wrong. So you can forgive, because your focus is upon God. Hear him in Genesis 50, verse 20. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it for good. You did me wrong, but God meant it for my good. Do we believe that? If we do, how can you say, oh, I'm not going to forgive them? It's part of God's plan. Joseph was able to forgive the great evil his brothers had done against him, and look past it and let go of all the afflictions connected to their evil, because God was his focus. We preach all the time, God needs to be our focus. And that's always so. When that happens, a lot of other things happen too. We're able to do things that we could not otherwise do. If we believe and live the truth of the sovereignty of God, we have reason to forgive those who hurt us. Seeing God frees us to forgive. Do you realize that the refusal to forgive, you are putting yourself in a prison? You are putting yourself in a prison. But when God is our focus, we've been set free to forgive. Joseph forgave his brothers. And Joseph had peace in his soul. He's sold into slavery. He had the peace of God. He's in Potiphar's house. He has the peace of God. He's wrongly accused. He has the peace of God. He's in prison. He has the peace of God. He forgives his brothers. And he has the peace of God. And the reason that he was able to forgive was that God was his focus. God was his priority. So we've all said it. We've all said it. Well, I can't forgive them because of what they've done. Well, that's twisted in a lot of ways, but we've run out of time. But you can. You can forgive if your focus is God. As long as you're focused on you, as long as you're focused upon the wrong, you will never forgive. But when the focus is God, you're able to forgive. When you have a relationship with God, you're able to forgive. Because I know God's forgiven me more than I forgive them, and less than what I've been forgiven. So the key is to maintain a right relationship with God. Because someone will do you wrong. I guarantee it. I'll tell you something else I guarantee. Now, hold on to your seat. Just hold on. You will do someone else wrong too. I guarantee it. I guarantee that in the coming days, you will be the offending party. And I guarantee that you will be the offended party. Don't act like you're never the offending party. There's many that, I believe, they actually think that. You're going to have a hard time convincing them. Don't ever get in that mindset. Don't focus upon the wrong thing. Forgiveness of others is a wonderful privilege. It's a wonderful opportunity. And it'll make your life a lot more enjoyable. You see, people who choose not to forgive, not only are they miserable, but it's their intent to make everyone else miserable too. Because they're always going to tell you how so-and-so did them wrong, wanting you to take their side. They're always looking to get even. That's not the trademark of a child of God. That's what the world does. Now, I realize that God's people can fall into that trap, but we won't if our focus is God, if our priority is God. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in verse song.